Olivia Brooks never imagined that 2 years of marriage could begin falling apart so quietly. There were no arguments, no broken promises, and no dramatic confession. Instead, everything changed in the smallest ways, the kind most people ignored until it was too late. Ethan had always been predictable. He left their townhouse in Queens every weekday just after 7 in the morning, caught the subway into Manhattan, worked as a software engineer for a financial technology company, and returned home before 6. They cooked dinner together almost every evening, watched movies on the couch, and spent weekends walking through Central Park or exploring neighborhoods they had never visited before. They had recently started saving for a larger home because they wanted to begin a family within the next year. Their life wasn't perfect, but it felt stable, comfortable, and full of plans. Then, without warning, Ethan's routine disappeared. It started with one late night. He texted Olivia that an important project had kept him at the office. She believed him without hesitation. A week later, it happened again, then twice in the same week. Within a month, midnight became more common than dinner together. Sometimes he didn't return until 1 or even 2 in the morning. He always looked exhausted. His clothes carried the faint smell of antiseptic instead of office coffee, and dark circles slowly appeared beneath his eyes. When Olivia asked whether everything was all right, Ethan simply blamed increasing workloads and changing deadlines. His answers sounded reasonable, but something inside her refused to accept them. The changes became impossible to ignore. Ethan, who had never cared much about privacy, suddenly placed his phone face down whenever it was on the table. He changed every password they had once shared without mentioning it. He disabled location sharing, explaining that a recent software update had caused problems, yet he never turned it back on. He began taking unexpected phone calls outside the house, often returning with an expression that mixed relief with sadness. Olivia tried convincing herself she was overthinking everything. She knew relationships went through difficult seasons, especially when careers became demanding. But each evening she found herself staring through the living room window, watching passing headlights and wondering whether one of them belonged to her husband. The silence inside their home became heavier than any argument could have been. One rainy Thursday, while organizing household finances, Olivia noticed a transfer she didn't recognize. $8,500 had been sent from their savings account 3 weeks earlier. The recipient wasn't a company or charity. It was an individual named Rachel Monroe. Ethan had never mentioned the payment. Their savings represented years of careful budgeting. Every vacation they skipped and every unnecessary purchase they avoided had been part of one shared goal: building a future together. Olivia searched through previous bank statements but found no explanation. That evening, she decided not to ask immediately. Instead, she waited. Ethan arrived home after midnight, carrying the same tired expression she had seen for weeks. Before going to bed, he plugged his phone into the charger in the kitchen and stepped into the shower. For the first time since they married, Olivia looked at his screen. A notification appeared before it locked. It contained only one sentence: "She made it through another night. Thank you for everything." There was no photograph, no last name, and no explanation. The message disappeared before Olivia could open it. Her hands began to shake. Every possibility she had tried to dismiss over the past month suddenly returned stronger than ever. She barely slept. The following morning, Ethan left early, kissing her forehead before quietly closing the front door. Olivia stood by the window until his car disappeared around the corner. Instead of starting work, she grabbed her coat, called in sick, and made a decision she never believed she would make. For the first time in their marriage, she was going to follow her husband. She told herself she wanted proof that her fears were wrong. Deep inside, however, she was terrified they were about to become real. Olivia waited until Ethan's car was several blocks ahead before following. Morning traffic moving from Queens toward Manhattan made it easy to stay unnoticed. She expected him to drive directly to his office near Bryant Park, but instead he exited much earlier and headed toward the Upper East Side. After circling several streets, he parked outside one of New York City's largest children's hospitals. Olivia remained inside her car, convinced there had to be a simple explanation. Ethan stepped out carrying a backpack she had never seen before. Instead of entering through the main lobby, he walked toward a side entrance reserved for staff and long-term visitors. Nearly 2 hours passed before he emerged. Beside him walked a young woman in her early 30s. She looked exhausted, wearing the same hospital visitor badge Olivia had seen on other parents entering the building. The woman suddenly covered her face as if trying to hold back tears. Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder while she leaned forward for a brief embrace. Olivia felt every hope she had been holding disappear in seconds. The scene lasted only a moment before they walked to the hospital cafe together. From where she sat, nothing about them looked romantic, yet grief could easily hide behind ordinary gestures. Ethan stayed for almost an hour before leaving alone and finally driving to his office. Olivia remained parked outside the hospital long after both had disappeared. She replayed the image again and again, convincing herself that she had just witnessed the answer to every late night, every hidden phone call, and every unexplained absence. She returned home without confronting him. Over the following week, she quietly began preparing for the possibility that her marriage was ending. She gathered financial documents, copied bank statements, and searched for divorce attorneys with strong reviews in New York. Every practical step felt unreal, as though she were watching someone else's life unfold. Yet she couldn't ignore the evidence she believed she had collected. The mysterious payment, the hidden messages, the hospital visits, and the unknown woman all pointed in the same direction. Still, one detail refused to fit. Ethan never seemed happier after seeing her. If anything, he looked more emotionally drained with each passing day. His exhaustion wasn't the kind that came from living a double life. It looked like the exhaustion of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share. One afternoon, Olivia decided to return to the hospital alone. She told herself she only wanted closure before ending everything. Sitting across the street, she watched families entering and leaving through the main entrance. Parents pushed wheelchairs, carried balloons, and held children's hands with expressions balanced between hope and fear. After nearly an hour, she finally saw the same woman from before. This time she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a small boy wearing a knit cap despite the warm weather. His face looked pale, and he moved carefully, holding an IV pole as they crossed the hallway visible through the hospital windows. The sight unsettled Olivia. She had expected secrets. She had not expected sickness. As she turned to leave, a volunteer carrying donation boxes accidentally dropped several folders near the entrance. Olivia instinctively helped gather the papers. While returning them, she noticed a poster promoting a national bone marrow donor program. Hundreds of smiling faces covered the display beneath one sentence printed in bold letters. "One match can save a life." Something about those words lingered in her thoughts all evening. Back home, Ethan arrived even later than usual. While hanging his jacket, a folded hospital parking receipt slipped from his pocket. Olivia picked it up after he had gone upstairs. The receipt wasn't from a visitor garage. It was issued to approved medical participants. She stared at the words for several minutes without understanding what they meant. Then another notification briefly illuminated Ethan's phone lying on the kitchen counter. This time, the message contained only 6 words. "Tomorrow is the final procedure. Thank you." Olivia no longer knew what to believe. The pieces were still connected, but they no longer formed the picture she had imagined. Olivia barely slept after reading the message. The words "final procedure" echoed through her mind, pulling her in 2 completely different directions. One part of her still believed Ethan was hiding another relationship. The other part had begun to notice details that no longer fit that explanation. Hospitals, medical participant parking, exhaustion, and messages about surviving another night sounded less like an affair and more like a crisis. The next morning, Ethan left before sunrise. Olivia waited a few minutes, then followed him back into Manhattan. Instead of driving to his office, he went directly to the children's hospital. This time, he parked in a restricted section and entered through the same side entrance. Olivia sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes before gathering the courage to go inside. The lobby was already busy with nurses, doctors, and anxious families. She kept her distance and watched Ethan disappear down a hallway marked for transplant patients. The word transplant stopped her cold. She had no idea why Ethan would have access to that area. Determined to find out, she wandered through the public sections of the hospital until she reached a waiting room near the oncology floor. Parents sat quietly beside vending machines and half-empty coffee cups. The atmosphere felt completely different from any hospital she had visited before. Nobody spoke loudly. Everyone looked as though they had been holding their breath for months. After a while, the same young woman appeared again. Up close, Olivia noticed how exhausted she looked. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she filled out paperwork. Before Olivia could decide whether to approach her, a nurse walked over carrying a clipboard. Olivia only caught a few words, but one sentence landed like a shock. The nurse asked whether the donor had already been taken into the procedure unit. The woman nodded and glanced toward the hallway Ethan had entered. Olivia felt the room tilt around her. Donor. The word repeated in her head while she tried to connect it with everything she had seen. She stepped outside into the corridor and sat down, suddenly unable to breathe normally. Memories from the past month began rearranging themselves. The late nights, the fatigue, the antiseptic smell on Ethan's clothes, the hidden phone calls, the large payment. None of it looked the same anymore. Several hours passed before Ethan finally emerged from the restricted area. He moved slowly, one hand pressed against his side, his face pale with exhaustion. A nurse walked beside him, speaking quietly while he nodded. Olivia had never seen him look so physically drained. He wasn't leaving a secret relationship. He was leaving a medical procedure. She followed him at a distance until he stopped near the elevators. For a moment, she considered walking up and demanding an explanation. Instead, she stayed hidden and watched him lean against the wall as though simply standing required effort. The young woman from earlier approached him carrying a small paper bag. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time Olivia saw something she had missed before. The woman's expression wasn't romantic. It was grateful, deeply, painfully grateful. Ethan accepted the bag, nodded once, and left the hospital alone. Olivia drove home in silence, feeling the weight of her assumptions settle over her. Yet one question remained. If Ethan had become a donor for someone, why had he hidden it from her so completely? That evening he arrived home earlier than usual, though he moved carefully, as if every step hurt. He claimed he had pulled a muscle at work and went straight upstairs. Olivia watched him disappear into their bedroom, suddenly aware that she had spent weeks preparing to leave a man she might not have understood at all. While cleaning the kitchen later that night, she noticed the paper bag he had brought from the hospital sitting near the trash. Inside was a child's drawing made with bright crayons. It showed a small figure standing beside a much taller one beneath a huge yellow sun. Across the bottom, written in uneven handwriting, were 7 words that made Olivia sit down before her legs gave out. "Thank you for helping me stay here." Olivia held the drawing for several minutes, unable to take her eyes off the uneven letters. It wasn't expensive or carefully made, yet it carried more meaning than anything she had found during the past month. Every suspicion she had built now felt uncertain. She wanted to ask Ethan the truth that very moment, but something stopped her. If he had hidden everything intentionally, there had to be a reason. The following morning he left home later than usual, moving slowly as though his body was still recovering. After he drove away, Olivia searched through the kitchen drawer where they kept receipts and household paperwork. She wasn't looking for proof of betrayal anymore. She was looking for answers. Hidden beneath old utility bills, she found an envelope from the hospital. Inside was a reimbursement statement for travel expenses. The amount was surprisingly small. Ethan had refused nearly every payment offered by the Donor Assistance Program. Attached to the statement was another document listing expenses he had personally covered: temporary housing, prescription medication, transportation vouchers, grocery cards. The total was almost identical to the mysterious transfer she had discovered weeks earlier. Their savings had not disappeared because of another woman. They had been used to keep a struggling family close to their sick child during treatment. Olivia closed the envelope and sat in silence. Every late night suddenly had an explanation. Every hidden call, every unexplained payment, every exhausted look on Ethan's face. But one question remained unanswered. Why hadn't he trusted her enough to tell her? Later that afternoon, she returned to the children's hospital. She no longer followed Ethan. Instead, she waited near the Family Resource Center until she recognized the young woman she had seen several times before. The woman was carrying coffee and looked less frightened than she had during previous visits. Olivia never introduced herself. She simply watched as volunteers greeted the woman by name and asked about her son. From their conversation, Olivia quietly learned that the boy had undergone a bone marrow transplant only days earlier, and that doctors were optimistic for the first time in months. The relief visible on the mother's face was impossible to mistake. Before leaving, the woman stopped at a wall covered with handwritten notes from families whose children had received treatment. She pinned a new card beside dozens of others. After she walked away, Olivia stepped closer. The card thanked an anonymous donor whose kindness had given a little boy another chance to grow up. It also thanked someone who had quietly made sure the family never missed a hospital appointment because they couldn't afford transportation or a place to sleep. No names appeared anywhere on the card, but Olivia already knew who it described. On her way home, she replayed the past 2 years of marriage. Ethan had always been the kind of person who solved problems without asking for recognition. He fixed neighbors' broken fences before they noticed. He volunteered during winter food drives without mentioning it. He donated blood regularly and never spoke about it afterward. She realized she had fallen in love with that quiet generosity long before either of them imagined buying a house or starting a family. Yet this time, his silence had gone too far. That evening, Ethan finally admitted he wasn't feeling well and went to bed before dinner. As Olivia placed a blanket over him, she noticed a small bandage hidden beneath the sleeve of his shirt and another near his lower back, where the medical procedure had been performed. He had endured weeks of discomfort while pretending everything was normal. Looking at him asleep, Olivia understood that the greatest distance between them hadn't been created by lies. It had been created by love expressed in completely different ways. She believed love meant sharing every burden together. Ethan believed love meant carrying the heaviest burdens alone. Neither of them realized how much that difference had been hurting them. The next morning, while organizing the mail, Olivia found one final envelope addressed to Ethan. It carried the logo of the National Donor Registry. Inside was a simple certificate thanking him for completing a life-saving donation. Folded behind it was a handwritten note from the transplant coordinator. The final sentence made everything clear. Ethan had specifically requested that no information be shared with his family until the child's condition became stable because he didn't want anyone celebrating while the outcome remained uncertain. Olivia carefully returned every document to the envelope exactly as she had found it. For several minutes, she simply sat at the kitchen table, realizing how completely she had misunderstood the past 2 months. Ethan hadn't been hiding another life. He had been protecting a fragile one. Yet the relief she felt was mixed with something heavier. If he had trusted her enough to marry her, why hadn't he trusted her enough to carry this burden beside him? That question stayed with her throughout the day. Ethan was recovering slowly. The donation procedure had left him weaker than he admitted, but every morning he still forced himself back to work, determined to keep life as normal as possible. Olivia noticed things she had overlooked before. He struggled to lift grocery bags. He moved carefully whenever he bent down. Some nights he quietly fell asleep on the couch before finishing dinner. Looking back, the signs had been there all along, hidden beneath the simple excuse of being tired from work. Several days later, Ethan received another message from the hospital. Olivia didn't read it, but she saw the expression on his face soften for the first time in weeks. He immediately grabbed his keys and left the house. This time she didn't follow him because she wanted proof. She followed because she wanted understanding. He drove directly to the children's hospital, carrying a small gift bag she had never seen before. Inside the lobby, volunteers greeted him warmly, recognizing him without hesitation. It became obvious that this wasn't his first visit. Olivia stayed far enough away to avoid being noticed. She watched Ethan enter a brightly decorated pediatric room where the same young mother was waiting with her son. The boy looked stronger now. He was no longer attached to an IV pole and smiled as he handed Ethan another drawing. The child's mother hugged him briefly before wiping away tears of relief. There was nothing secretive about the moment. It was simply the gratitude of a parent who had almost lost everything. As Ethan left the room, the transplant coordinator stopped him in the hallway. Olivia couldn't hear every word, but she understood enough. The latest test results showed the transplant was working exactly as doctors had hoped. The little boy's body was beginning to accept the healthy cells. Months of uncertainty were finally giving way to hope. Olivia quietly left the hospital before Ethan could see her. Driving back across the Queensboro Bridge, she felt ashamed of how easily fear had rewritten every piece of evidence into the story she expected to find. She had allowed silence to become suspicion, instead of asking the difficult questions sooner. That evening, Ethan arrived home carrying fresh groceries, pretending once again that everything was ordinary. Olivia prepared dinner as they had done hundreds of times before, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. She noticed how carefully he hid his discomfort whenever he reached for a plate or lifted a pan. The quiet between them no longer felt cold. It felt unfinished. After dinner, while putting away the dishes, Olivia opened the folder containing the divorce papers she had downloaded weeks earlier. She looked at them for a long time before feeding every page into the paper shredder beside the desk. The sound filled the room like the closing of a chapter she never wanted to relive. Then she walked into the living room where Ethan had fallen asleep with his laptop still open. Resting beside it was an email from the donor registry, thanking him for giving a stranger the opportunity to celebrate another birthday. At the bottom of the message was one sentence that stayed with Olivia long after she closed the computer. It explained that most donors never truly understood how many lives were changed by a single decision, because the impact reached far beyond one patient. Looking at her husband sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, Olivia realized that the greatest gift Ethan had given wasn't only to that little boy. Without knowing it, he had also saved their marriage from becoming another casualty of fear, misunderstanding, and silence. All that remained was one final truth she needed to hear from the only person who had been carrying it alone. The following Saturday, Olivia asked Ethan to take a walk with her through Flushing Meadows Park, a place where they had spent countless afternoons dreaming about the future they wanted to build. The autumn air was cold, and the trees had already begun losing their leaves. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply walked side by side, just as they had on their very first date. Olivia finally admitted that she knew about the hospital, the donation, the financial transfers, and the little boy. She also confessed that she had spent weeks believing her marriage was falling apart. Ethan didn't seem angry. Instead, he looked disappointed in himself. He explained that several months earlier, he had received a call from the National Donor Registry informing him that he was a match for a 6-year-old boy with an aggressive form of leukemia. Doctors warned him there was no guarantee the transplant would succeed. The child might not survive the procedure despite everyone's efforts. Ethan couldn't accept the idea of filling their home with hope if everything ended in heartbreak. He believed it would be easier to carry the uncertainty alone than to watch Olivia suffer beside him. When the boy's mother struggled to afford temporary housing in Manhattan during treatment, Ethan quietly used the savings they had set aside for a bigger home. He planned to repay every dollar through overtime and freelance work before Olivia ever noticed. None of it was meant to be a lie. It was a promise he made to himself that if the child survived, only then would he tell her everything. Instead, the silence became so heavy that it nearly destroyed the one relationship he was trying to protect. Olivia realized she had made her own mistake. She had trusted her fears more than the man she had loved for years. Rather than asking difficult questions, she had answered them herself. They both understood that secrets, even those created with good intentions, could quietly grow into walls between two people who loved each other deeply. Several months later, they received an invitation from the Children's Hospital. The little boy had completed his treatment and was healthy enough to attend the annual celebration honoring donors, medical staff, and families. Olivia stood beside Ethan as the child ran across the room with more energy than anyone had imagined possible just months earlier. He handed Ethan one last drawing. This time it showed a small house with 4 people standing together beneath a bright blue sky. In one corner, a tiny heart was drawn above the roof. There were no words written anywhere on the page. None were needed. Driving back to Queens that evening, Olivia looked at the city lights reflecting across the East River and realized their future no longer depended on buying a larger house or reaching every financial goal on schedule. The strongest foundation they could ever build was honesty, even when the truth was painful. A year later, they finally welcomed their first daughter into the world. They named her Grace because, after everything they had survived, that was the word that best described the life they had been given. Whenever people asked why they had waited so long before moving into a bigger home, they simply smiled. Some investments never appear on a bank statement. Some become another child's birthday, another family's hope, and another chance to come home. And every time Olivia watched Ethan hold their daughter, she remembered how close she had come to losing the man whose greatest secret had never been another woman. It had been the quiet decision to save a stranger's life while asking for nothing in return. 5 years passed faster than either of them expected. Their daughter Grace had started kindergarten, and the little townhouse in Queens that once felt temporary had become the place they loved most. The walls were covered with family photographs, children's drawings and memories that no longer revolved around what they didn't have, but around everything they had gained. Ethan never spoke publicly about the bone marrow donation. Outside of their closest family, almost nobody knew the story. To him, it had never been something worthy of recognition. It had simply been the right thing to do. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived from the hospital. Inside was an invitation celebrating the 10th anniversary of the pediatric transplant program. Former patients and donors were invited to attend if they wished. Olivia convinced Ethan to go. When they entered the event hall in Manhattan, dozens of families filled the room. Children laughed, nurses hugged former patients, and doctors proudly watched lives they had once fought to save. Across the room, a young boy walked toward them carrying a soccer ball under one arm. Olivia barely recognized him. The pale child she had once seen holding an IV pole had grown into a healthy, energetic 11-year-old. Without hesitation, he thanked Ethan for giving him the chance to grow up. His mother stood nearby with tears in her eyes, explaining that her son had no memory of the transplant itself, but he knew every part of the story. Before leaving, the boy handed Grace a small envelope. Inside was the first drawing he had ever made for Ethan years earlier, carefully preserved all that time. On the back, written in much steadier handwriting than before, were a few simple words. "One stranger saved my life. Now I want to spend mine helping others." As they drove back to Queens, Grace asked why the boy had given her the picture instead of keeping it himself. Olivia smiled, looking at Ethan before answering. Some stories were never meant to belong to just one family. They were meant to remind everyone that a single act of kindness could continue changing lives long after the moment itself had passed. Ethan quietly reached for Olivia's hand, and for the first time since everything had happened, neither of them thought about the weeks filled with fear and doubt. They only thought about how close they had come to letting silence end a love that had always been built on compassion. Sometimes the greatest love stories are not about extraordinary romances. Sometimes they are about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when nobody is watching. And years later, those quiet choices become the reason someone else gets to have a future.